Welcome to the road to becoming a disability-confident employer. People are just coming online all across Canada right now, and we know there are a few technical challenges people are facing getting everything lined up. So just to make sure everyone gets a chance to get on and is with us, we're going to take 10 minutes. So go ahead and take a health break, get a glass of water, and then we're going to start in 10 minutes. See you soon.
Hello, bonjour, Gui. I wish to acknowledge that we are located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, a land that's intended to be shared peacefully, and to acknowledge that we are all treaty people. I'm very excited today to be here and to welcome a very exciting event, Becoming a Disability Confident Employer. I think we're in for a treat this afternoon, and I hope that everybody takes the time to really absorb the information that we're about to receive. It's information that we are all, which we all consider important, and we've got some experts in the field, and I'm going to be introducing a lady by the name of Tova Sherman shortly, who is truly a national expert in the field of employment and disability. I am Darren Ruck, and I am the co-chair of the Atlantic Diversity Community of Practice. I'm also manager with the Public Service Procurement Canada, and I'm pleased again to be here today. The ADCOP group, the Atlantic Diversity Community of Practice, I've been involved for many, many years, since 2010 to be exact, and I've seen our mission and our membership grow over that time, and we're very excited to be partnering with reachAbility Nova Scotia for this very, very important event. I want to take at this time to welcome to the stage Tova Sherman, who I spoke briefly about. I'm going to allow Tova to really introduce herself because I have no words. I've known Tova for so many years. She's an incredible individual, a light of energy, and again, a national expert and treasure in the field of disability and employment. Tova?
Thank you very much, Darren. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for taking time out of your very important and busy day to take a moment and really reflect on the how, the why, and the now what of becoming a disability confident employer. Today, we're going to have a very interesting schedule, starting with, in a matter of a few minutes, at 1 o'clock, Mme. Laroche, Yazmine Laroche, will be providing us an update as well as answering some really interesting questions that have come from across Canada. She will be interviewed by our own Mara Toombs. Mara is going to join us as she is a registered social worker and continues to be, and a reachAbility facilitator. She's also the pre-employment support navigator and leads the creative team for the Blue Nose Ability Arts and Film Festival, which is really Canada's only totally inclusive arts festival for both professional and emerging artists with disabilities. We're very excited to have Mara here and collaborating with our day. And as I mentioned, she will be having a conversation with Mme. Laroche and bringing some of the questions that you, our viewers today, have sent in advance for Mme. Laroche. Once we are done with that, I want to give you a 10-minute break because it's very important that you have an opportunity to grab your water, catch a breather, and then I'm going to be back to talk about the road to becoming a disability confident employer. That will be between 30 and 45 minutes, after which we'll take another 10-minute break and then come back with an incredible panel, which I'm going to share with you a little later. For right now, though, I would like to invite back Darren, and on behalf of his entire team, allow him the opportunity to invite our very first guest and welcome her, Mme. Yazmine Laroche. Darren?
I'm back so soon.
Well, forever, but you know me, Darren.
It is really indeed my pleasure to introduce Yazmine Laroche. She's been someone who our department, Public Service Procurement Canada, has spoke about and really sees as a leader in disability for all of public service, but certainly her words and her wisdom has been guiding our own strategies within our own department. Deputy Minister Laroche was appointed Deputy Minister of the Public Service Accessibility Office in August of 2018. She has over 25 years of experience in public policy, program design, delivery, communications, strategic planning, and corporate management. She's worked federally with departments such as Communications Canada, Canadian Heritage, the Privy Council Office and Treasury Board, as well as Infrastructure Canada, where most recently she served as the Associate Deputy Minister of Infrastructure and Community. She began her public service career as a communications officer with Transport Canada, and she was appointed as the Assistant Deputy Minister in the year 2000, and in 2004, she joined the Privy Council Office to develop the Government of Canada's New Deal for Cities, and in 2009, she was appointed the Assistant Deputy Minister, Executive Policies and Talent Management for Oak Grove. Ms. Laroche is the Deputy Minister Champion for federal employees with disabilities. She is an alumni of Carleton University and the past chair of the Board of Muscular Dystrophy Canada. And at this time, I'd love to welcome Mme. Laroche. Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Daryl. What a lovely, lovely, lengthy introduction. I'm really honored to be here to meet with everybody. I'm so grateful to reachAbility and the Atlantic Diversity Community of Practice for inviting me today. It's a real honor. I'm so thrilled to be able to talk to you about a little bit about the Accessible Canada Act, about the implementation of Nothing Without Us, which is the accessibility strategy for the public service of Canada, and to tell you about some actions that we're taking to remove barriers to accessibility and disability inclusion at work so that you can build more disability confident workplaces. So let's start with the Accessible Canada Act. As I'm sure many of you know, that act actually came into force over a year ago now, in July of 2019. And this act has the potential to really improve the lives of Canadians with disabilities by removing barriers that prevent full participation in our communities and in our workplaces. The legislation also has given us the authority to work with stakeholders and Canadians with disabilities to create new accessibility standards and regulations that will apply in all federally regulated workplaces. And these new standards are going to set requirements for organizations to do three things: to identify, to remove, and to prevent barriers to accessibility in 7 areas. The first, and that's one that Daryl knows a lot about because he works at PSPC, and that's building and public spaces. The second is information and communications technologies. The third is communications other than ICTs. Next is employment. Subsequently, procurement. What do we buy? Program and service design and delivery, which is hugely important for the public service. And finally, transportation. And the most important thing, I think, for me, is that the Act also calls on the Public Service of Canada to lead by example and to become a model of accessibility. And that's where I come in. My job and my office was created in August of 2018 with a really simple mandate to help the federal public service get ready to meet or exceed the requirements of the Accessible Canada Act. And since that time, we've been very hard at work. We've been engaging with employees with lived experience of disability and our allies across the public service and beyond to co-develop and to drive implementation of this strategy. It's called Nothing Without Us for a reason, because it is all about being built out of the experience of people living with disability. And it sets out a very simple vision. It's to become the most accessible and inclusive public service in the world. And based on what we heard and based on what people told us, we developed 5 areas in this strategy that people said were the most important if we were really going to make a difference in our public service. The first is all about employment. It's how do we improve the recruitment, the retention, and the promotion of people with disabilities. The second is all about the built environment. Public service is huge. We have 300,000 employees scattered from coast to coast to coast, in some really high-tech, modern buildings, and in some heritage properties. So how do you make sure that that built environment works for our employees and for the Canadians that we're serving? The third is information and communications technology. Here we are doing a Zoom conference, and it is a fantastic technology. And we know that technology can be incredibly enabling, but we know that when the accessibility features of technology aren't activated, it can be incredibly disabling. So that is huge in terms of the public service. The fourth is related to programs and services. It's about how do we actually support and equip our public servants so that they can design and deliver accessible programs and services. And finally, the one that underpins everything else, and is probably the most complicated, is how do we build a culture of accessibility within the public service? So that's our strategy. But that strategy and its goals, they're just a roadmap. We need all public servants in every organization, deputy ministers, senior leaders, managers, everybody to commit to actually making it happen. We need to make this strategy real. We need to make it last, and we need to make sure that public servants have what they need to be both disability and accessibility confident. Now, if some of you haven't yet had the opportunity to read the strategy, I'd really encourage you to do so. It's accessible online. It's not very long, and I think it's a really nice document, and you can find it at canada.ca/accessiblegc. You know, I was thinking back to my last conversation with Tova, which was back during the last week of May and National Accessibility Week. And we were full into COVID mode at that time. And here we are again. I was so looking forward to coming and meeting you in person. But of course, we know that COVID is going to be with us for some time. And that's completely transforming the way that we do things. And that's why I think events like these are so important, because they allow us to check in with our colleagues, both with disabilities, our colleagues who are allies across Canada, some of whom we know are feeling very isolated because of the challenges imposed on us by COVID-19. At the same time, though, and I don't know if you're finding this in your own workplaces, it's important to acknowledge that some of our colleagues are actually flourishing. They're flourishing from being able to work from home. I know for me, I love not having the commute. I think I'm actually more efficient and productive working from home, but I really miss the personal contact. I miss my people. But I'd like to know what we can learn from people who've already been working from home. We know that flexible work arrangements are at the top of the list in terms of accommodations requested by people with disabilities. So what can we learn from people who've already been doing this? What best practices have you already come up with so that you can be productive and you can stay connected with your team? And how can we simplify and accelerate our processes to make sure that people can work effectively from home? You know, in preparing for this event, my team and I talked a little bit about, and I know this is a bit of a contentious phrase, but I'm going to try it anyway. Sometimes we say that our disabilities can be a kind of a superpower. People with disabilities have a lot of innovative ideas and solutions because we have to find hacks to navigate the world around us. As one of my friends likes to say, if you know, trying to figure out how to work in an environment that doesn't love you, you have to have some ingenuity and some creativity. So this sharpens skills in certain areas that maybe others haven't had as much practice developing. How do we tap into that? How do we use that? This diversity of backgrounds and lived experiences, it makes us so much stronger as a public service, as communities, and as a society. I really believe it strengthens our creativity, our resilience, and our ability to solve complex problems, to have many perspectives around the table, whether it's a virtual or a physical table. So this event today, I think, is so timely as we come to the end of Disability Employment Awareness Month. Like you, employment of persons with disabilities is at the forefront of our work because we know that people with disabilities have consistently experienced lower levels of employment and continue to face obstacles in participating in the labor market. People with disabilities continue to face barriers and stigma when they're looking for work or looking for workplace accommodations or trying to advance our careers. And when it comes to our public servants, the federal government is working hard to fix what's been identified as one of the biggest barriers to a great employment experience, and that's workplace accommodations. So we launched something called the Centralized Enabling Workplace Fund, and it's a little pot of money that's been given to us to invest in tools and resources, pilot projects, test approaches, and it's all about improving the way that we deal with workplace accommodations government-wide. One of the key initiatives that we've launched under this fund, and one that I'm so proud of, is called the Government of Canada Workplace Accessibility Passport. The passport is a tool, and it's designed to facilitate conversations between an employee and their manager about the barriers that the employee faces in trying to do their job. And what are the accommodations that are needed to get past those barriers. And what the passport does is it records the tools and the support measures that the manager agrees to provide the employee. And this passport is updated on a regular basis or as circumstances change. With a completed passport, it means that employees avoid having to, what I call, relitigate workplace accommodations every time they change jobs, change managers, or change organizations. We're right now testing this passport in about 12 early adopter departments and organizations. And the feedback that we're collecting is going to be used to design the online version of the passport that we are hoping to launch right across the Government of Canada. My hope is that this is really going to help to streamline what is a very unwieldy and complicated process. This fund is also being used to work with other departments in the federal government to look at how we can improve existing processes and experiment with innovative solutions that can be scaled or replicated right across the federal public service. So here's just a few examples of what we're working on right now. We're working with Shared Services Canada, and we're creating a lending library of the most commonly requested adaptive devices and technologies. And it targets a particular subset of employees. And these are students or term employees that have temporary or short-term accommodation requirements. And again, the goal there is to streamline and shorten what can be a very cumbersome process. Another initiative that we did that is so important because we're very data-driven, as we all know in the public service, we've conducted a huge benchmarking study in 2019, and that was 2 government-wide online surveys with over 6,000 responses. And it allowed us to understand better what are the existing challenges around the workplace accommodation process. And we got feedback from both employees and from managers who'd either put in an accommodation request or were trying to manage an accommodation request. And it was incredibly helpful. It kind of confirmed things that we knew anecdotally, but it's really good to have that level of feedback. So yes, it confirmed that the process is complex, it's time consuming, it varies depending on what department that you're in. And often managers feel like they don't actually have the guidance or the resources that they need to help them navigate through this process. We heard loud and clear that procurement is a pain point and that the process for just getting the appropriate accommodation-related products and services is not easy to navigate and takes a really long time. We also heard that 4 out of 10 employees who responded told us that they were taking extended sick leave at some point in their career because they had not gotten the accommodations that they needed. That's troubling. Saying that you don't have the tools that you need, which means that it has such an effect on your health that you actually have to go on extended sick leave. We heard a lot about the need for supporting documentation, the level of evidence that's needed, and how that contributes to delays as well, but also contributes to misunderstandings between employees and their managers. And we also heard a lot about cultural communication challenges, bias. We heard a lot about fear of stigma, particularly from people dealing with invisible disabilities and just generally not feeling supported. So we now have a really good baseline of information to understand the situation, which is going to really help us in developing some of the solutions. When it comes to hiring, I'm sure you know that the public service is committed to hiring 5,000 new persons with disabilities by 2025. And work is underway to help us achieve that goal. The Public Service Commission has launched a federal internship program for Canadians with disabilities to help increase employment opportunities and to create a much more diverse federal public service. And they're also in the process of reviewing existing recruitment and career development programs to make sure that they are including and not excluding people with disabilities. I wanted to touch on some of the conversations that we've been having over the last few months as a result of some terrible incidents related to racism and other forms of discrimination. These discussions really kick-started by terrible events leading to a lot of momentum around Black Lives Matter. We're having unprecedented conversations in the public service right now. And there's a lot of soul searching going on about the nature of exclusion, about bias, both conscious and unconscious, and about systemic discrimination. There's been lots of questioning about representation right inside the federal public service and a huge desire to fix the underlying problems that prevent us from being as diverse and inclusive as we want to be. The recent speech from the throne set out some pretty significant commitments from the government with respect to diversity, inclusion, equity, including some initiatives specifically designed for people with disabilities. And this has been further emphasized through commitments that every deputy minister in the federal public service is now making around diversity and inclusion in the context of our performance agreements. And these are specific actions that we're committing to take to establish a culture of inclusiveness, to increase the representation of Black, other racialized and Indigenous people, as well as people with disabilities within all levels of the organization, and ensuring that our internal policies and programs and our external policies and programs are inclusive and free of systemic racism and barriers. All of these initiatives, I think, are going to help drive us to being a more accessibility confident public service. I get really excited by hearing from my colleagues and engaging with partners about being disability inclusive. I can tell you that since I started this job 2 years ago, I'm just hearing more and more about how accessibility is on everybody's minds. People want to know what they need to do and how they can do it better. So one of the things that we've done to help is we've created an accessibility hub that is currently available to public servants on an internal website called GCpedia. And it's a one-stop shop where employees and managers at every level can find tips, guidance, and tools on accessibility and to removing barriers for people with disabilities. And we work all the time with our partners and we curate the resources that are constantly refreshing the site. I and my office, we continue to engage throughout the public service. We do a lot of engagement activities, including through the Canada School of Public Service. And we're working with the Canada School of Public Service to really embed disability and accessibility confidence in programming for all the functional communities and for management and for leadership programs. And the other thing I do is that I meet directly with senior leadership in every single department. My goal, my team likes to say, she likes to share the love. And by that, I mean, I want every deputy minister to feel accountable for accessibility. I want all senior leaders and managers to feel responsible for accessibility, because it cannot be just a few of us. We all have to be part of making a difference. Everybody can make a contribution. In fact, every time I meet with senior leaders, I ask them, and I will continue to ask them, what's their plan to reduce the gap between the representation of Canadians with disabilities generally in the population and the current representation in the public service? I think that the conversation and the momentum around diversity and inclusion is so high right now, and it's a great opportunity to make sure that the perspectives of people with disabilities are part of this conversation. Because one of the things that I like to say is that disability does not discriminate. It doesn't care what your age or your gender or your sexual orientation or your racial or cultural background is. Disability cuts across everything. So I'm encouraged by the change that we're starting to see, and it's so important for us to be able to measure the change. You can't just talk about it. It can't just be anecdotal. So we do have ways of tracking and measuring progress because it's important. It's important that we be able to say, this is how change is happening, and here's how we're tracking it. One of the things that we're doing is we're piloting what we're calling an accessibility self-assessment tool. And it's a little tool that departments can use to assess where they are right now in the context of the 5 goals of our strategy. And it actually gives guidance on what they can be doing to remove barriers and respond to each of those 5 goals. We've made good progress in the last 18 months since we launched the strategy. And to mark International Day of People with Disabilities on December the 3rd, we're going to be releasing a progress report on what we've accomplished. So please watch for it and help us spread the word so that we can keep the momentum going. I know one of the topics you're going to be coming back to this afternoon is how to be a disability confident employer. When I think about what that means, to be disability confident, I think, is to encourage managers to be positive about skills that people with disabilities bring to the workplace. So that means stop thinking about disability as a problem that needs to be solved, but actually as a different kind of life experience that is going to make a positive contribution and a difference in the workplace. And disability confidence in the workplace means being confident about asking questions about how do we remove the barriers to make it better for people with disabilities to come and work with us. Disability confidence means we develop policies and practices that include people with disabilities. Disability confidence means that we ensure that the needs of people with disabilities are taken into account at the beginning when we're creating employment opportunities. Disability confidence means not being afraid to try. It means being willing to be open and say to people, I want to make a difference. I'm probably going to get some things wrong. I'm going to make some mistakes, but I commit to learning from my mistakes and to doing better. I think that will really help us to become more disability confident. And the other thing I want to mention is that culture change is hard and it takes time. But we shouldn't let that discourage us, because when it comes to inclusion, small steps will take us a very long way. And if everybody is taking a small step, then we are going to make a difference, and it's going to be a lasting difference. Don't wait for your deputy minister or your senior leaders to say, this is what we need to do. Each one of us can make a difference by opening a door and opening our hearts to people who think differently, who experience things differently than we do. I think that's what's going to help us be so much better as a public service, as a society, and as a country over the longer term. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you today. I wish you a great rest of your conference, and I think we've got some more questions that we're going to be answering soon. So thank you.
Hey. Hello, Deputy Minister. Are you able to see me? Am I on the feed? Hello. Yes? Hi. So I'm Mara Toombs from reachAbility, and I get the honor of asking you questions that have come in from public service employees all across Canada. So I will be bringing you these questions, and I'm very excited about them because I feel like I was thinking about what questions I had, and these embedded all through them are the things I'm curious about, and also things I've never even thought about. So I think we have a lot to learn from where other people's curiosity brings our discussion. The first question that came in was, when the pandemic first hit last March, my wife, who suffers from PTSD, said, "Welcome to my world." You mentioned how many persons with disabilities have adapted quickly and shown the way in terms of innovation. And this person wants to know, during these unusual times, how can we give persons with disabilities the opportunity to have a lead role in guiding us in how we manage this pandemic?
I think that's a really great question, and I thank you for the question. And I have two answers to it. I think it's really important that as employers, we tap into the experience of our employees. So we should always be willing to ask, what can we do to make things better? I think that's hugely important. That's a big question. And one of the things that I've observed during COVID is that managers are having conversations with their employees that they maybe never had before. Conversations like, how can I support you so that you can be as productive as you can be working remotely? And so I think having those kinds of conversations and maybe flipping it sometimes and saying, and what have you learned? And what's your experience like in working remotely? And how might that help some of your colleagues who are just getting used to this? I think those are great questions to ask. But the other thing I would say is sometimes people put the emphasis on people with disabilities to solve their problems, if you know what I mean. And so there's a balancing act there. I think what we want to do is create an environment where we are actively looking for the best possible advice on how to do things, but at the same time, we're not putting pressure on people to, step up and do things. You gotta meet people where they are in terms of what they are prepared to share and how they're prepared to share. So thank you. Thank you very much for that question.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I think that is such a balancing act between giving people the opportunity to share their lived expertise and putting them on the spot to always be a person doing extra work potentially.
Yeah, and also, well, I have a disability, so if you have a question on disability, come and ask me. And sometimes that gets tiring. So it is a balancing act, and we just need to be respectful of people and where they're at.
Absolutely, thank you, Deputy Minister. So the next question that came in was, outside of the built environment, what are some of the key barriers to employment that persons with disabilities have identified?
Well, yeah, so the built environment, it for sure is huge. I mentioned technology. So we've rolled out Microsoft Office 365 across the public service, and it's got some really good accessibility features. But what we heard from members of the community was, for reasons that we don't fully understand, not all departments were switching on those accessibility features. So imagine the frustration. You've been given this new tool, and it's supposed to do all these things, except you don't have access to those tools. So that's an area. It's the inconsistent application of solutions, and whether it's in technology or in other areas. Another area, and this is an interesting one, this came up mostly through COVID, and it had to do with communications. We put a lot of focus on IT. But one of the first lessons that we learned in COVID, I don't know if you remember at the very beginning, lots of press conferences, the Prime Minister was speaking to Canadians every day. There was no sign language interpretation. And that was very quickly pointed out to us. and we mobilized to get that done. And really proud of the work that was done. Excellent sign language interpretation that was made available to everybody, which kickstarted the conversation more broadly about, so how are we doing at communications, and are we reaching Canadians where they are, as opposed to where we think they ought to be? And so some very good conversations happening, lots of focus now on plain language communications and updates to our Government of Canada communications policies to make sure that we are being accessible by design. So those are some of the big barriers that we've heard about. But there's always new ones emerging, and that's why you've got to be flexible and adaptable and in constant learning mode.
Yes, this quality that I've heard you speak about in the past of universal design, I think that really is such a good example with the Microsoft. It's like the departments that knew they needed it were probably turning it on, and other departments aren't aware of it because someone hasn't made a request, potentially. That could be that kind of attitude of we just make it available all the time instead of waiting for a request or needing it to be extra. That's really showing us the way. And in terms of, same with, we've got closed captioning for this conversation today, and that's helpful to lots of people who wouldn't necessarily request it. So we're really appreciating those features becoming ubiquitous. So that's interesting that you mentioned plain language, because that was my next question. We got a question from a worker that asked, in the federal government, we talk about using plain language, yet we often use wording very specific to government or difficult to understand. How can we get better at making our communications more accessible through plain language?
That is a great question. So a couple of things that I think the person who asked the question will be interested in. So internally to government, just recently the government had launched something called the Accessible Communications Portal for employees. It just went live, I think, last week. And it provides all kinds of tips on how to do more accessible communications. There's it's either just happened or is about to happen a webinar on plain language and accessible communications, which I think is really, really important. The other thing is that there's a new organization called Accessible Standards Canada, and they were created through the legislation, and they're the body that's going to be creating a lot of the standards and regulations related to the Act. And they are currently working on standards and guidelines on plain language. So I think, so there's lots of attention being paid to that. People laugh at me. I've spent most of my career in the public service, and sometimes when I'm writing documents that people who are not public servants are going to read, they just roll their eyes at me and say, who writes like that? Who speaks like that? It's almost like we have our own language in the public service, and we need to be able to communicate what we do in a way that works for everybody. My litmus test is my mom. I want to make sure that whenever I'm talking about what I do, that my mom can understand it. My mom's an immigrant, and English and French are not her first language. So I want to make sure that she can understand me. So that's really, really important. Thank you.
Yeah, I love your answer. I think that quality of communicating with your mother, someone once said to me, if you can't explain it to your grandfather, you don't really understand what you're talking about. So there is sometimes it can be nerve-wracking to speak in plain language because it can make us seem less sophisticated sometimes when we're talking, but also it shows sometimes the gulf in our own knowledge of really getting down to brass tacks, because plain language is plain, right? We really have to be able to explain it clearly. And I appreciate an increase in plain language as a person who doesn't work for the government. When I read things that are more plain, I feel so like the doors are opening instead of closing to people from the outside. That's a wonderful change. But that quality of defining even how to do it or what it is, I love that there's more training coming, because it's a big culture change. You do have your own language. It's like academics. They all speak in their own vocabulary amongst themselves, and even interdepartmentally, they can't communicate a lot of the time.
True. It's very, very true. When I feel badly, I just go read an academic text, and then I don't feel so badly about how we communicate in the federal government.
Absolutely. It becomes harder and harder to stop doing, as I understand it as well. So the next question we got is, persons with disabilities is a very broad term, covering a wide range of people with different skills and abilities. How can we make sure that persons with disabilities are hired into jobs where they will be successful? That's the question.
Oh, that is a great question. And it's true. You know, there's tremendous diversity in the disability community. That the definition in the Accessible Canada Act is very broad, intentionally, and very inclusive. And the focus in the Act is to remove barriers, right? It's about the disability interacting with the barrier. And so that's why the focus is on removing the barriers as opposed to fixing the person. And you're right, when it comes to employment, we know that working age adults with disabilities are much less likely to be employed than people without disabilities. So 59% employment rate for people with disabilities versus 80% employment rate. So that's a pretty stark, which goes to show that, you know, we haven't done enough yet to be as inclusive as we can be. Things that we can do, I think we have to rethink, and maybe COVID is helping us a little bit here. Again, and this isn't just in the public service, but people tend to develop almost straitjackets about how we think about work, right? We think a job has to be done a particular way. And then we think that a job has to be done by a particular type of person with a particular type of background. And I think one of the things that COVID has done, well, COVID has exploded the myth that most work has to be done in an office setting. So as you think about that, so if work no longer is tethered to a physical workspace, then does that mean that we can think differently about how the work gets done, and more importantly, about who does the work? And I'm optimistic. I think that that is going to be huge. And I do believe that you need to be able to kind of invert the conversation about, does the person fit the job? But I've got this really interesting person with all kinds of skills and talent and potential. How can I redesign the job to take advantage of those skills? It requires a different way of thinking about work, but I think it's where we have to go. And I think, frankly, the way that work itself is evolving. I think the other thing that we can do is we're partnering with some really interesting organizations across the country who are by design are intended to help not just people with disabilities, but managers and people who are hiring them, and they provide coaching and facilitation to make sure that there will be successful outcomes. And I think we need to do more of that. It's not so much about helping the person with a disability figure out how to do the job. It's helping the manager understand that there may be different ways of doing that job. So there's a huge training component, I think, that's required as well. But I think that's a little bit about how we need to do it. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for your answer. Yeah, obviously, you know, from our point of view, we think training is the answer to a lot of things. When we go and talk to organizations and people within the government, we really see the opportunity for, and a lot of thirst for training. Actually, people are saying, oh, this is a big culture shift. How are we going to learn how to do this? Let's work on this. And what I hear from people I work with in the community who have disabilities, who are facing employment barriers, is sometimes the flexibility is around the tasks, but sometimes it's, you know, if only this was a part-time job, or if only this was a flexible time job where I could do it in the best 40 hours of my week instead of during those hours. And I think we have seen a lot of that kind of adaptation during COVID, but I look so forward to seeing more of it. People being able to bring their skills to the table, you know, if they're fatigued in the morning, working later in the day, or working a few days a week. Traditionally, we've had so little opportunity to be flexible about that. So it's looking up.
And it's built into our processes, and it's built into our infrastructure. It's built into things like collective agreements, right? You know, that work is X number of hours a week. Like it's a very, it's like the old factory model of work almost. And work, the nature of work is evolving so much. So I think we need to evolve with it. And by doing that, I think we will create more opportunities for people with disabilities.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And when I was so excited hearing about your passport that has been launched, as I understand it, and the idea that appeals to me is that it will reduce the need for people to be advocating and advocating and advocating again for the same accommodation. And I hope also that there'll be a process through which those passports are being revisited or revised too, obviously, because Tova talks about this. Tova Sherman, who will be coming on today to talk, she talks a lot about the notion of how, you know, once we make an accommodation, we can't just set it and forget it because people's needs are also changing all the time. So sometimes there's been that traditional manager thing of like, you already told me you needed this thing and now we're doing that. Do we need to talk about it again? So needing to have a culture of recognizing that people's needs are always shifting.
Exactly. I think that's a really important point. Requirements change, but you know, equipment changes, solutions change. So these kinds of things can't be static, and that's why we've built in. You know, we're recommending that it be revised anytime circumstances change, or at a minimum once a year, just so that there's an opportunity to update it. But it is really important, and I like to give the analogy. So I like to say to colleagues, what would we tolerate a work environment where every time an employee starts a new job, moves jobs, starts a new job, they have to start a whole cumbersome process to get a laptop, some pens, a computer, a desk, a chair. Like we would never allow that. We wouldn't tolerate it. We'd say, well, that's just crazy. No, we just need to make sure that people have the basics. So I think, again, it's a mind shift. What are the basics that somebody needs so that they can be productive in their job and they can actually succeed? For me, maybe it's because I've been doing this for a while, but it's just so obvious to me. And yet we're not there yet. We are on our way, but I'd like it to be considered as basic as you need a desk and a chair if you're going to do this job. I'd like to see it be that basic.
Yeah, I feel that I'm confident that's the direction we're going with a lot of things because it feels like that's the shift. So the next question I have is, what role do community organizations supporting employment for persons with disabilities play in terms of supporting the government's current hiring initiative? How can government departments best tap into these organizations that exist in the community?
I think that's a great question, and it builds a little bit on the previous question, I think, about employment and how do we make these things work. Community-based organizations are huge assets because they're community-based. They understand the community. They bring a certain level of expertise. And they can also be incredible resources in terms of identifying talent. So we have been doing, has suggested, is there a different way to promote self-identification? Can we talk more about identity and our multiple identities? And is there an opportunity to have a week where we celebrate our multiple identities and we use that to encourage people to describe themselves and who they are and what makes up our identity? I have a disability, but I don't feel that it is my defining quality. And I think that's part of it as well. It's you don't want to be labeled as a thing. I also, I have a biracial heritage. I have a mother who's an immigrant. My father was Quebecois. I have lots of facets to my identity. And I hate being labeled as you're this and you're kind of, so I think there's a problem with how we think about this. So I think that's one. The other one is the very real concern about stigma. And again, I think this is particularly acute for people with invisible disabilities because they see how hard it is for their colleagues with visible disabilities and say, oh my goodness, if I self-identify, then am I going to start having all those problems too? So it is a challenge. What I've observed in organizations outside the public service who are dealing with these issues, often what helps is when senior leaders in an organization disclose publicly and are actually willing to start to share their own condition, their own situation, their own challenges. That seems to be a really important piece in helping to start to lower the temperature and the stigma around it. And so I think what it takes is more people being willing to self-disclose. And especially, I think this is where leadership becomes so important. There are people with invisible disabilities in the most senior levels. I think if they started to self-disclose and come out publicly, I think it'd be amazing what that would do for people at every level of the organization. So that's probably an imperfect answer, but it's the best I can do. It's a tough.
Well, we're talking about a culture shift, and this is complicated. So there isn't going to be just one answer, obviously many answers and a lot of work, but I do definitely second the feeling that that quality of it coming from the top, there being leadership and a culture, there can be a tipping point quality if you start to see more and more representation around you that at a certain point it just feels safe. And so if we do more, as the public service does more hiring and people are more comfortable talking about it, potentially then it becomes more safe for other people to come along. And hopefully that's the direction we're going. I really appreciate speaking to you about this today and all of your answers. Deputy Minister, thank you for joining us. We're gonna now switch gears and we're going to go on to a presentation from Tova Sherman. So thank you very much for joining us. And we're gonna take a 10-minute break for those of you who are watching so everyone can take care of yourselves and come back in 10 minutes. Thank you. Bye.
Welcome back, everyone. Here, let me take this off. Welcome back, everyone. You met me briefly at the beginning, but I haven't had an opportunity to really introduce myself. My name is Tova Sherman, and I'm here today because I want to talk to you about genuinely key actions that you need right now if you are to become a disability-confident employer. This presentation is really dedicated to the ease of inclusion of diverse groups, but obviously for today's purpose, as we're discussing disability confidence, we want to focus on the expansion of your workforce, being more inclusive, and of course, that including persons with all types of disabilities. So far, all you know about me is my name, and I'd like to tell you a little bit more. I'm actually, as a first person voice. I do live with disability. I'm the youngest of 5 children, and all of us lived with diverse types of disabilities. My brother lived with Crohn's. My mother has no voice box and uses a Servox. I tell her she sounds like Stephen Hawking, very smart. My father lives with kidney issues, and so on. So growing up in a family where people had all types of disabilities, I must tell you, I didn't think it was a big deal. Now, when I was in school, right up from kindergarten, I knew something about me was different. I remember that first day of kindergarten, at least I think I do, and walking into that room with all the windows and the door and all the toys and thinking how exciting this was. And then having someone come and take my hand and walk me into the other kindergarten. It had no doors. I remember it had no windows. It was darker, and I immediately knew somehow I was different. Now, it's a long way from kindergarten till university for me, but I want to share with you, as a person who is on the ADHD spectrum, or as we call it, ADHD spectrum disorder, which includes both ADHD and ADD. It is a spectrum, and I always say it's like a rainbow without all the color. You can be mild, medium, or severe. I am quite severe on the ADHD spectrum, which also means that I'm probably dealing with some serious comorbidity or comes with some mental health challenges. I live with anxiety and depression, and I have to manage those, and at this stage in my life, more so than the ADHD. So I wanted to let you know that I'm here not just as a professional in the community, but as an individual who has seen disability from all sides and took that experience and started reachAbility over 20 years ago, frankly, because of that experience. Now, reachAbility is an agency that is dedicated to the inclusion of all persons. I always like to say we're inclusive of disability, not exclusive. The last thing we want is an exclusive club when we're trying to be, that's right, inclusive. Now, in addition to my work with reachAbility, I am also the founder of the Blue Nose Ability Arts and Film Festival, which is an incredible festival here in Canada for first-time, emerging, and professional artists from the disability arts community to participate. We want to equalize the playing field for all of our citizens with disability in the arts and, of course, in education and employment. Finally, before I begin the discussion around what this means and how to be more disability confident, I wanted to let you know there's one more little title for me, and that is author. I am the author of a book called Win, 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 the 18 inclusionisms you need to become a disability confident employer. We're going to be drawing for some of these today, so if you're online right now, there's going to be a survey later, and we're going to ask you to fill it out, and your name will be automatically entered to win 10 books for your office. I'll even initial them for you. The importance of this book is it brings together all the experience of myself and my team over the years and allows us to really distill all of our learning into something very specific that you can access, utilize, and immediately put in practice. So here in this book, you see over 20 years of observation, communication, and frankly, best practices. Now, I know Mme Laroche touched briefly on what a disability-confident leader is to her, but in the context of my discussion, I wanted to be very clear. You are a disability confident employer if you're already benefiting from drawing from that widest pool of talent possible. It means so much to me when people say, I'm not just dusting off the old job ad, I'm not just looking for the same old homogenous crowd, but I am looking at securing, retaining, and developing team members with disability who are skilled, loyal, and hardworking, just like anyone else. By stepping up to being a disability confident leader, you are truly an ally. And I use that word very seriously because frankly, those of us from marginalized groups across Canada, we need allies. And we need allies in the federal government who understand the ease of inclusion. I often say it is different, not difficult, to include persons with disabilities. Right now, as a disability confident leader, you are in a position to influence other departments and your networks and showing them the way to become disability confident. When I think about how to be a disability confident leader, I suspect, as I've said, many of you may already know, but I believe with just a little guidance around thought and practice, you can show others the way. And that is genuinely why I wrote the book, Win, Win, Win. Because I believe, as Mara said it, we are at a tipping point around inclusion of persons with disabilities. And the federal government is leading that charge. You know, the paradigm was always clear for people like me who have disability. We were always considered medical paradigm, meaning we were broken from birth, we needed to be fixed. We weren't all okay. And that paradigm has really slowed down the progress around inclusion of persons with disabilities. It has created a lot of myth, and it has allowed that myth to stand. We need to talk about that paradigm shift. We need to talk about the tipping point. And the shift is where persons with disabilities, well, we call it the social paradigm. I call it the human rights paradigm. Because persons with disabilities deserve a voice for themselves and by themselves. The Accessible Canada Act, or as of course we call it the ACA, as it speaks to it more specifically, not for us, without us. Couldn't say it better myself. And the other term I just wanted to touch on briefly before I move into some of the content of the book is the term inclusive recruitment. Really the process of connecting with, interviewing, and hiring a diverse set of individuals through understanding, through valuing their different backgrounds and their different opinions, is the key to inclusive recruitment. Inclusive recruitment should be intersectional, and of course, it's much more than gender or race. Which is why I'm here, because I am an advocate of inclusive recruitment, and I am specifically interested in disability confidence. Now, I know you're here for a reason. You're here because you are federal public service employees. You are here because the ACA passed and speaks to a tremendous responsibility, starting with the federal government. It's also because we have provincial legislation from Ontario, recently Manitoba, BC, and right here in Nova Scotia. We know this and we want to integrate all of that into where we're going as disability confident leaders. It is because everyone today is experiencing or cares about someone who is experiencing a disability. This is not a niche group. And of course, most recently, we have the Deputy Minister Commitments on Diversity and Inclusion, 2021, which Mme Laroche mentioned, and I'm going to be addressing here as well by connecting some of our disability confident messages with, in fact, those very commitments that you yourselves need to look at and take on. I thought it would be really interesting and instructive to apply some of those inclusionisms that I want to talk about that will directly support you in achieving the goals and benchmarks that the Deputy Minister's commitment on diversity and inclusion speaks to. Excuse me. I'm probably doing that for our friends doing ASL, so they get a break. Okay. The Deputy Minister's commitment on diversity and inclusion, which many of you may know, but I'm just going to briefly talk to, as very specific around establishing baselines in terms of where you are today, creating objectives, which is really looking at your action plan and targets for inclusion. And what I'm most interested in touching on, engaging with those equity groups that you can work alongside, that you can ID, remove, and ultimately support the prevention of any new barriers to inclusion. This is all essential if we're serious about diversity and inclusion and improving representation. The thing about agencies and the importance of connecting with agencies like reachAbility, as Deputy Minister Laroche mentioned as well, is that we are nimble. Let me explain that. Agencies like myself we didn't really realize until COVID how nimble we were and how nimble we had to be. Let me explain. I'm a CEO of a mid-size NGO, and COVID challenged so many of my notions about how we could do our work. And my office is made up of persons who do identify with living with all types of disability. So here we were even having our eyes opened to some of the possibilities. And the cool thing about agencies like reachAbility is that nimbleness, that ability to respond and continue to respond in support of your department that's wanting to improve representation of diverse populations. It is our capacity to do what needs to be done quickly and frankly nimbly that adds an element of importance to that relationship with agencies. When we talk about improving representation, we really first must build that foundation within your existing team before we start building in, before we start deciding what next. We must have our foundation of understanding and preparation in place for welcoming those diverse employees we wish to include. An intuitively inclusive workplace is what I call it, meaning it should be a second nature. I say like brushing your teeth when it comes to inclusion. And that does take education and osmosis, as I like to say it. In fact, that is one of the inclusionisms in the book that I first wanted to talk about. The idea that there are two ways to ensure education. I'm going to show you the page. Ooh, you can't read it because it's so far away. Beautiful artwork as well. I'll get to that a little later. The fact is there are two ways. Education and osmosis. And when I talk about an intuitive environment, that means the education has been done, meaning the work has been done, and osmosis, meaning we are working with people already from diverse backgrounds, and therefore much of the stigma or myths that we have built up about differences can be removed. But it takes genuine commitment, consistency, to truly improve representation, to think outside of that traditional box. For instance, where am I advertising? Are we doing that which we have always done, brushing off the advertisement and putting it into the same paper? I want to tell you a brief story. There was an incredible story that came out of England. A very large department store, much like a Marks and Spencer's, had made a decision a number of years ago, it's a few years ago now, and they made the decision that they really wanted to engage youth in England. There's a huge unemployment situation around youth in England, much like in Canada, and this department store wanted to make a difference by inviting people not to be entry level, but assistant managers for managerial positions. So they did what everybody does. They put their ad out, called for youth, put in their ads, and lo and behold, they waited and waited. And they couldn't understand, where's all the people saying, I'm a youth, I need a job, this is a great opportunity. They didn't understand it, and the word got out. They were complaining, where's all the youth? Well, the media picked up the story. Youth don't even care about work when opportunities like this are out there and no one grabs it. So what happens? All of a sudden, a swarm of applicants come from youth. We have to ask ourselves, what happened? What happened was these advertisers are using traditional environments where youth do not go. They are not reading the Globe and Mail necessarily, I do, some do, but that wouldn't be my first stop to reach out to unemployed youth. So we must go where they are. And that's really the message when I talk about improving representation and identifying where people are and doing more than the traditional, what we used to. Listen, in this diversity and inclusion commitment, which I thought was really informative and interesting, and if you haven't reviewed it, please do. It's quick and easy, and more importantly, I'm addressing it, so you might want to watch this again after you've read it. But whichever directives you choose to focus on, the good news really is that your team is going to benefit from any of those activities you take because they will make you more inclusive as an office and as a team. But it all starts with the leadership. Disability confident leadership. The commitment document is really clear. Everyone watching today is being asked to ensure a culture of inclusiveness by fostering inclusive leadership through training. I mentioned education and osmosis. Education is crucial if we're to sincerely create that culture of inclusion. We've got to be sure that we are replacing the old myths with actual fact. Otherwise, I don't see how it's possible to move forward authentically. Providing an adequate support around, for instance, mental health and wellness is one of the directives. But how do we do that when myths are still sitting so clearly right in the middle of all of this? Wellness at work is, in fact, the #1 reason for short and long-term absences in Canada in the workplace. In fact, 40% of short and long-term disability claims in this country are related to mental health. It is, in fact, the #1 cause of disability in the world is depression and mental illness. So, you might be surprised to hear, I don't think you will be, that employees in Canada feel the workplace is where they are least likely to get support. In fact, 64% of those surveyed in Canada said they would never reveal their disability condition or issue at work if they don't have to. In other words, if you can't see it or it's not terribly obvious. I want to give you a few more facts because I want to really get you thinking about the importance of removing myth if we are to proceed with growing an inclusive workplace and being disability confident. You may not be surprised to find out that over 20% of workers in the prime of their working lives, 20% will suffer a bout of mental illness. You may also be surprised at the cost, and I say this because, frankly, the numbers are staggering. Did you know that mental illness is costing the Canadian economy over $8.5 billion, and that's just on long-term disability claims relating exclusively to mental illness. The fact is that our economy is losing $9.3 billion annually just in short-term leave around mental health challenges. And $51 billion a year is the amount that our ignoring or attempting to not deal with mental illness is costing the Canadian economy every single year. So it makes sense, right, to engage in dialogue in order to remove that stigma, to host diverse inclusion events, to promote and support different initiatives. But if we're going to talk about stigma, I need to take a moment and talk to you about the power of stigma. In fact, it's what I call inclusionism #5. There it is. Stigma's power, it lies in the silence. The silence that persists when, frankly, discussion and action should be taking place. The silence that one imposes on another for perhaps speaking up on a taboo subject, like mental illness. Upon disclosure, society often brands us, and I say us because it's me, not just with disability, which frankly, I'm okay with, I self-identify, but it removes my capacity to succeed because often it's my very competence that comes into question. All of a sudden, all my ideas, my decision-making processes, they're under a new scrutiny. I feel like I'm being told I am no longer of value. That's what stigma does. And until that changes, silence and the stigma that silence is feeding will continue to challenge our workplace. I always remember a few years ago going to the doctor, and I had this rash, and I went to the clinic, and the doctor said, "Oh, I see you take anxiety meds." He didn't even look at the rash. He just said, "It's anxiety." I believed him. He's my doctor. I went home. A few days later, the rash was worse. I went back again. Again, a different doctor told me, "Oh, I see you take anti-anxiety medicines. It's probably stress." I went home. At this point, the third time I went to the hospital, I was in so much pain I couldn't even get myself there. I walked in, a nurse took one look at me and said, "It's shingles." Now, if I had not been on anti-anxiety meds, I am sure that shingles would have been identified by the first doctor. We don't even appreciate sometimes how deeply stigma permeates in every element of our lives. And certainly for those of us living with mental health issues, it's especially true. But the real question is, how would you know better? And this is why it's so important to create the knowledge base for your staff from the top down, because there's really only 4 ways we formally learned about disability. Perhaps in the family, with the whispers of an uncle or an aunt, or perhaps giggles about how silly they are. We're rarely laughing with them. Or the schoolyard, which for me was an extremely cruel place, where people make fun of anything different. Maybe you saw some information through movies, where something extraordinary or extreme happened that's only happening in the movies. Hardly a source of information. Or perhaps you watch the news. I'm a bit of a news junkie, but I assure you, you will never hear a report on the bipolar gentleman who's married with 3 kids, holding down a job, seeing his therapist, staying on his meds, and doing damn well. They don't report those stories. So if we're depending on the media as our source, we only know the extreme, that very small percentage of the extreme behaviors. So if we truly value diversity, then we have to appreciate and frankly take a moment to think about where our perception of disability originated and ask ourselves how we are going to establish a culture of inclusiveness, how we're going to give that information over so that we all can understand and value diversity, and you as leaders can lead the way through both education and osmosis. And osmosis simply meaning when you work with people with disability, I can always tell when I'm presenting to a group and I discuss something around maybe physical accessibility and I see heads doing this. I know that person has probably worked with someone who uses a wheelchair because they're like, yeah, no big deal. That's osmosis. If we have never worked with someone with diverse disabilities, is it reasonable, based on where we learn about disabilities, to expect anything but stigma unless we're prepared to change that message, unless we're prepared to replace it with disability-confident information? Look, one of the messages in the directive was that inclusion must be valued from the top down. That's not news. We understand it starts from the top down. But one of my favorite inclusionisms, and I'm just going to turn to the page because I think it's so important, is the fish stinks from the head. You're going to be the fish stinks from the head. That's right. And guess what? As CEO of reachAbility, I'm the head of the fish. And I always say, if I want my team to integrate inclusion as part of their everyday thinking, if I want it to become literally osmosis as well as education, it starts from the top. Inclusionism number 4, the fish stinks from the head. Because if leadership is the art of giving people a platform for spreading ideas that work, then as a disability confident leader, you actually have the capacity and ability to create a fair and equitable workplace that allows new, creative, different ideas to flourish. Now that's truly a win-win-win. Speaking of win-win-win, which I'm doing a lot of, I wanted to talk about diversifying your team, how we remove barriers to inclusion, and frankly, promote that shift to thinking. It reminds me of another inclusionism. One second. The inclusion I wish to mention is one of my favorites. Screen in, don't screen out. Anyone today watching will know that when we take an HR course, human resource course, one of the first things they teach us is how to screen out. I have a great picture here in our screen in, screen out page by a local Nova Scotia artist. I should tell you that every ism has been complemented not only with an explanation of it in the book and even an in practice section on how you can apply the ism, but an artist with disability that works with the Blue Nose Ability Arts and Film Festival created a piece to complement that, to create another connection to the message. And I'm very excited for all of you to see the book. Is this where I get to say it's on Amazon.com or CA? We'll do that later. We're talking about screening in and not screening out. This is the ADHD girl bringing herself back. HR taught us screening out is designed to eliminate candidates who don't meet basic requirements. Okay. Now screen in means to be open to different ways of achieving that experience. That doesn't mean if you're a surgeon, I'm going to take I played the game Operation. But, although I love that game, but what I am saying is that we've gotten very good at screening out. There's no reason I should consider this person. Hold on. Forgetting the experience, let's look at gaps. One of the first reasons people love to screen out is a gap in resume. But I want to share with you the gap in my resume. I came back to Nova Scotia because my father was very ill. I was living in Ontario. That was over 20 years ago. I stayed and chose to stay because I moved him in with me and I took off time to live with him and take care of him to the end of his days. Now, I know you, as a leader, would want to know that and not necessarily choose to screen me out due to a gap, but rather you might be a little bit curious about why the gap. And that's where screening in comes in versus screening out. Being curious about it enough, and we're gonna talk about curiosity. In fact, let me put it this way. Disability confident leaders, one of their strengths is being curious. You want to ask, I don't know, is there really only one solution to this challenge? And is it really only going to be me? The truth be told, from the job ad right to the promotion opportunity, the leadership must be truly curious. And I don't mean what the heck is wrong with you curious. We all know that's not real curiosity, but genuine curiosity. Because when we maintain the dignity of everyone around us, just by staying curious, we can do that. Now, I'm just using the definition of curious, which is non-judgmental, honest, genuinely interested in the why, just so we're all on the same page. So you might ask, well, why should I stay curious? Well, I'm going to tell you, first of all, it makes your mind active. It keeps it active instead of passive. I'm going to be frank with you. I am an incredibly curious person. I always like to joke, I have a need to know and Google has a need to tell me. But the truth is, curious people ask a lot of questions, and that's not a bad thing. That means our minds are active. It also, when you are curious, you are actually proven to be more observant and more able to absorb and welcome new ideas. Because when you're curious about something, your mind expects and anticipates new ideas. It's already juicing up for something you hadn't thought of before. Also, it brings excitement. That's right. You're opening up new worlds and possibilities because it takes a truly curious mind to look beneath the surface and really discover some of the incredible possibilities that exist. Now, how to stay curious? Well, you know, we were so curious as kids, and as we grow up, somehow I think it's beaten out of us a little bit. But if we can keep an open mind, meaning, are we prepared to accept the possibility that we're not correct about everything as leaders? That perhaps we can change our mind? That's the art of staying curious, keeping an open mind. Not taking things for granted, digging a little deeper than the surface to see what's going on around you, and asking questions relentlessly. That's right. Why is that happening? When will that happen? Who, where, and how? Those are the best friends of curious people. So if you really are committed to the idea of curious, remember not to label something as boring, because curious people, we don't really get that bored. I can't remember the last time I was bored, to be honest, because I'm always curious about something. We read diverse things, even things we don't always agree with, even publications we don't always abide by. By allowing your mind to be curious about other perspectives, you would be surprised at the incredible thoughts and creative outcomes you can come up with. You also want to be sure, if you want to stay curious, to be open-minded from this moment right to the end of this presentation. Because this is going to be a place where curiosity is embraced, and the things that make us who we are should be and will be genuinely celebrated. You know, it was Einstein who said, "I have no special talents. I am only passionately curious." Well, I'll tell you, if it only takes passionate curiosity to be Einstein, I'm in. But in all seriousness, the connection is clear. By being curious, you are more likely to be inclusive. By not jumping to the conclusions of what you think is happening, you and members of your team are showing genuine curiosity, which is ultimately one of the key ways you're going to be that disability-confident employer. You know, I remember very clearly, I was on a subway in New York a few years ago. I say everything's a few years ago because of COVID. I don't want you to think this is all happening. But I was on a subway and I was sitting across from a man, and I always remember this so vividly. He had his hands in his face in his hands, and he was absolutely not looking up. And there was 2 or 3 kids running in front of him. You could tell they were his kids. And there was this very well-dressed woman just in the next bench over from him. And the kids were bumping into her and running back and forth. And finally, I was waiting for this, she stood up and she walked over him, which is not very New York, by the way. And she said, "Sir, can you control your children?" And at that moment, his hands were moved and he looked up and his face was white and his eyes were red. And he said, "I am so sorry. My wife just passed away and I just don't even know what to say to my children." I paused there because curiosity. "Sir, are you okay? Sir, is there anything I can do?" Curiosity would have resolved what was clearly a very difficult situation. And I ask you to consider how you're staying curious and to challenge your teams to do the same. Because by staying curious, it is truly your best weapon when you want to identify and address structural inequities, that you want to ensure the transparency, and accessibility, which takes me to inclusionism number 10, right person, right job. But then it takes me to inclusion number 7, people don't come with instructions. But I think I'm going to settle on inclusion number 5, which is if you meet one person with ADHD, or as I say, people don't come with instructions. Okay, we're not IKEA furniture, right? And if you're going to meet, for instance, Tova, who lives with ADHD, you can be sure you've met one person with ADHD. That does not mean you know how to handle ADHD, or more importantly, how to accommodate ADHD, which really takes me to my number 12-ism, which is revise, revisit, and reassess. Because if we're serious about inclusion, we need to stop and talk briefly about accommodation, which is what inclusionism 12 is all about. Accommodation is far more manageable for people when you view everything from the eye of universal design and the 3 R's: revise, revisit, reassess. Meaning, if someone requires accommodation of any kind, it's not enough to say, we did it, we got you exactly what you needed. No. We have to revisit that accommodation. We have to check in. We have to make sure things haven't changed, perhaps for the better, perhaps not. But we must be prepared to revisit. And when we think of universal design, and what I mean by that, and I know most of you know that term, but just to be clear, it means including as many people as possible in your space. And that is more than just architectural. One of my isms, you can remove all the architectural barriers in the world. It is the attitudinal ones that will remain, and that's a reality. Now, before I wrap up, I really want to share with you just one more of the isms from the book. And it's the last one. And it is simply, I make a difference because I can. This is my superhero making a difference, if you're interested. The bottom line is, making a difference is frankly all you can do. And the way you make a difference, whether that's letting your voice be heard, joining a committee, if you're already on a committee, maybe getting more active on that committee, volunteering for a favorite cause outside of work that really connects you to something important to you, to express your opinion during a discussion, even if it's unpopular, because you making a difference means that when you do something positive, you can think more about, how do I expand on this? It's not enough to just do it once. How do I grow this? We had an issue from COVID where clients were working from home but didn't have the equipment, something that Mme Laroche touched on with her equipment. Well, we at reachAbility also have an equipment program called HELP, or Home Equipment Loan Program. How easy was that acronym? The bottom line is, we also recognized issues and gaps in accessibility and capacity to join us. And HELP, our equipment loan program, has changed a tremendous amount and allowed us again to be nimble and move forward. So I want you to stay open-minded. I want you to think about solutions, because there's a lot out there. And you making a difference means that you are prepared to take a moment and try something else if that's what it means, if that's what needs to happen. Because you're making a difference all along, and you probably have been by supporting ongoing training for your team, ensuring you've laid that foundation of a healthy workplace environment and culture that welcomes everyone, remembering not to allow preconceived notions. After all, where did we learn these myths? We don't want them getting in the way of hiring or retaining the best. I urge you to use the guideposts of honesty, integrity, curiosity, and self-awareness. You know, there's a quote I've always lived by, because as a person on the ADHD spectrum who does live with mental illness, I have my limits, and I know it. There's certain things I can't do. But there's a quote that I've been living by, and I want to share that with you before I let you go. And the quote is by actually a poet from the 1800s, Edward Everett Hale. And he said, "I am only one. Oh, but I am one. And I cannot do everything, but I can do something. And I will not let what I cannot do ever interfere with what I can do." And frankly, if you are planning on being a disability confident leader, you also need to identify those things you can do, be accepting of those things you cannot, but never, ever let the things you can't do get in the way of the things you can. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Win 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 is available on Amazon.com and CA for pre-order. And I'm hoping we have time for questions, but this is where I get to go ask Mara if we do. And I'll put my mask on and move out of the way.
Okay, so I'm going to hop in here, and I'll just ask a question and then step aside so Tova can come back and answer it. We've been getting questions from the internet. One question was, where can we get the book, which we've already answered. But another one was, if we have hiring targets that we're working with around hiring people outside of, what we have traditionally hired, and we're trying to hire where there were gaps, how can we avoid tokenism? So if you want to speak to that, I will get 6 feet away over here.
We're having so much fun with the jog, you have no idea. Okay, we're getting good at this. We have targets, but truthfully, as I've read in your directive, the targets are not so much set as to be set. But that said, the idea of tokenism, there's only one way to avoid that. Education and osmosis. That's right. I said it, because there is no other way. If people have a belief that it is tokenism, it will become tokenism. There is no leader in the federal government public service who can afford at this time to even think on those levels. As Mme Laroche says, it has to become natural. It has to be that intuitive inclusion that I talk about. And without building that foundation of intuitive inclusion, it being natural, everyone understanding the importance from the top down, and when you make certain measurables, which is what I'll call them, the key is, are we hiring the right person for the right job? And if we are, we're good. And if we're not, there's a problem much deeper than inclusion of persons with disabilities. I hope that addresses it to some degree.
Thank you for that answer. Another one just came in from YouTube was, can you comment on the term unconscious bias? Or is there a better way to describe this? But how unconscious bias is part of this sort of process?
In a sense, I did address unconscious bias in talking about where we learned about disability, because that's really where the bias is built. Unconscious simply means we're doing it, but we're not even aware we're doing it. That shows a lack of education and a lack of osmosis. In other words, I have not spent enough time with folks with disabilities from diverse communities to be comfortable, to understand what I need to know, and to ensure that I'm not letting my understanding of disability come from media, the schoolyard, whispers in the family, but I've been provided from my leadership access to good, clear, appropriate knowledge that replaces all of those myths that have been permeating forever. I know for a fact that when polio was a big deal in the early 50s and in the 40s, even in the early 40s, the reality is that people used to drive around the block of a person who had polio because they wouldn't even drive on the street. That's unconscious bias. It's not even realizing you're driving around the block when you are. That's a lack of knowledge. And that's why one of the clearest, most prescient directives in the entire Deputy Minister Communauté is really around removing these things through the education from the top down, and ultimately the unconscious bias goes alongside that. And the osmosis, the bringing in of people who are diverse, who will then say, oh no, you can say, you know, somebody says, you want to go for a walk, and the person uses a wheelchair. Don't worry about it. That's the least of their problems. Usually they'll make a joke if I say that. Or did you watch Grey's Anatomy last night and they're visually impaired? That's okay. We've got to remember that although we're very polite Canadians, and that's a good thing, we never want the fear of offending be the very reason we offend, because we're avoiding. When you avoid, you remove dignity. And I say inclusion is all about dignity, plain and simple.
Thank you, Tova. I really appreciate that quality of getting over our fear of trying to do everything right in order to start to actually just be honest about where we are, and then we can start to learn. So another question that came through was, you had mentioned that 64% of people with invisible disabilities say they would not identify their disability to their employer unless, you know, it was an urgent need. How, if that's true, then how can we get an honest picture of how, you know, the actual prevalence of disabilities in our workplace and the needs of our coworkers and employees?
Although we're going to be addressing that in our next segment, which is with the panel, and one of the folks that's going to be joining us specializes in getting that very information in some very interesting ways. There's a lot of surveys going around, but the particular partners that we work with at reachAbility through our Inclusion in Action program have a proprietary survey that allows us to not only get into some of the incredible details and experiences of people without outing them, but it allows us to then address and ask further questions, again, within the anonymous way. But that 64% has to change, and it will if we all follow some of the basics that we're discussing today around education, osmosis, and of course the panel will be breaking down the hows, the real application of the information that both Mme Laroche and I have been able to share to date. So let's definitely hold on and get to that panel, because they're going to answer those questions in a way that probably I'm unable to.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And so we're going to take a break now. Thank you for your remarks, Tova. We're going to take a break for 10 minutes so people can take care of themselves. And we're going to meet back here in 10 minutes. Hopefully everyone will be hydrated and stretched, and we'll be hearing from our panel of experts. So take care.
Hello, over here, and welcome back. As promised, we're going to now speak to our panel. And our panel today is made up of, well, besides me, 3 incredible experts in their field. First, allow me to introduce Jessica Ward. Jess is a successful entrepreneur and advocate who has committed herself to the community in her most recent role as the lead of programming for reachAbility. Jess has truly dedicated herself to equalizing the playing field for our most marginalized populations across the province. Both as a first-person voice and disability expert, this mother of 4 is a true community activist who speaks from the heart, but she backs it up with clear, decisive action. Her leadership and expertise have made and continue to make National Accessibility Week Nova Scotia, the Blue Nose Ability Arts and Film Festival, and Inclusion in Action the successful programs they are. In fact, Jess is here because she is spearheading the new projects division of reachAbility as it pertains to disability-related legislation across Canada. Next to Jess, we have Carrie Marshall. Carrie is a community advocate and research enthusiast. She joined reachAbility Association in 2020 as a job developer, but her role has clearly grown within the REACH team, and she works closely with individuals pursuing success in the workforce, employers looking to expand their group, as well as matching, hiring, and retaining needs for employers, as well as persons with disabilities looking for employment. Carrie's community-based research and education have really prepared her to build strong, effective relationships with both clients and community, allowing her to act as truly a supportive bridge between the two. On the end, I'd also like to welcome Shelley Allward-McLeod. Shelley is the owner and founder of HR on the Go, Inc. She is the board president of ADR Atlantic Institute, which is Dispute Resolution Group, as well as the board secretary of the Boys and Girls Club right here in Greater Halifax. Shelley brings over 25 years of experience in all areas of employment law, human resource management, occupational health and safety management, and much more. After her schooling, Shelley's career was spent entirely in various industries, working as the senior executive responsible for human resource and labor relations. She's worked both nationally and internationally in union and non-union environments in education, hospitality, IT, long-term care, manufacturing, not-for-profit, and tourism sectors. Certified in alternative dispute resolution, Shelley's also able to provide mediation, conciliation, and arbitration services. And these services are as varied as the clients themselves and include workplace assessments, investigations, facilitated discussions, and coaching. Shelley lives in Dartmouth with her husband Earl and their beautiful black lab Cosmo. Thank you, all of you, for being here today. I have a number of questions, but I really wanted to start with you, Jess, because really for me, the key of this discussion is to understand what services the Inclusion in Action team is offering. And perhaps we could start with simply, what is Inclusion in Action?
Thanks, Tova. So Inclusion in Action is the overall umbrella of the inclusion and accessibility services that we at reachAbility provide to employers and organizations across the province and beyond, across Canada. And so it's really a combination of the 3 pillars, and I was actually going to turn this way, but
it's over there.
Over here on our slide. So what we've done is we have created different levels of engagement. As you mentioned when you were speaking earlier, a huge part of being inclusive and creating an accessible workplace is having that culture shift. And one of the ways that you can do that is through different layers of engagement amongst your employees. So we have Inspire, which is our keynote speaking. So experts such as yourself and the rest of our team can go out and speak to organizations in person or online, as we're doing today, to really offer a message of inclusion and accessibility and talk about the many barriers that are faced by employers and also by their employees. So that is one of the first pillars of our Inclusion in Action. The Inspire piece.
Got it.
Yeah. We like to start there because you really need to get some engagement and really kind of pull at the heartstrings of those people who are going to be putting change and starting that whole climate of change. The next pillar is train. you've touched a lot on that as well. And that was really where we kind of started with reachability, was through our social enterprise of offering training modules. So we offer customized training modules to help with anything from diversity and inclusion to mental health in the workplace. I remember there was a question that came in around unconscious bias. So we talk about that for unconscious bias for leaders and many other things. And we really take a stance of customizing that to the needs of the employer or the client who comes to us.
And that's the train. So we've talked about inspired train, but to be honest, it's the plan part of inclusion in action I think that our federal employees are going to be most interested in. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. So the plan part of inclusion in action is our accessibility services or our action plan development section of what we do. So as part of the ACA, as I'm sure everyone who's watching is aware, action plans are required to be completed and to be reassessed every year or every 2 years, depending on the different requirements for your department. And so inclusion in action, the plan pillar, is how we have created a very simple 5-step process to reaching that action plan and getting the accessibility plan in place. And we are able to really combine a number of things through those 5 steps that we're able to offer as a customized thing for our clients. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about that.
Well, one of the most important elements, and it came up, was the survey piece, because although we hear a lot about surveys, and I'm going to move to you, Carrie, if I may, because you have a tremendous experience in survey, and you've really been leading the charge to understand how we can utilize surveys in ways that we've never really thought about. So although there's a lot of talk around survey, I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about why IIA is utilizing a survey to get the information and some of the unique elements of the survey that's being used by the Reachability Inclusion and Action team.
Sure, no problem. I think it's important to realize first that the surveys that are being talked about are more internal. The survey that we are able to provide is, it's more of a third-party perspective. And there's also different ways of measuring sort of the baseline of what's happening, and the correlations that can be made can go from different departments, different levels across the provinces, and it just gives a really good opportunity to have a rounded perspective. It also allows us to go back when we have to reassess and have a very clear-cut baseline to compare to from one to the other, as opposed to the different surveys from other people.
Right, so I know for a fact, like the inclusion in action surveys that we use are particular in that they are able to glean information without necessarily, as I call it, outing people, because that's one of the concerns. Is that we can do that, right?
Yes, absolutely.
I sound silly, but I want to make sure I'm promising things that we do, I should say.
Yes, and so what that looks like is the surveys are anonymous and or confidential, depending on how it's set up, but the really exciting piece of that is that there needs to be at least 5 people responding to the question in order to make it a valid response. So there's no one person that can be specifically shown in the survey. There has to be a minimum of 5 answers in order for it to be qualified to show.
And that allows for even more anonymity or confidentialities, I guess we would call that. I really appreciate that. Shelley, I really want to start with a very basic question, which is how has the role of HR, and maybe your role, because you have been an HR expert for years and someone that Reachability utilizes as one of our many experts involved in the Inclusion and Action team, but could you share with us a little bit how your employers and HR has ultimately changed in this sort of tipping point time, as we like to call it?
Right. Well, thank you for that question, Tova. So certainly in the role of HR, from my perspective, the thing that has changed the most over the years is retention of employees. And there's not just a magical tree that we can go out there and pick people from. So it's being able to retain people and realizing that we probably have the people in our organization that can do the job. We don't often have, and we're hearing this term today, right people, right job. And oftentimes we don't have the right people in the right job. And sometimes it's because we haven't given them the right tools, and we haven't given them the right training, we haven't done the right planning. So I really think that I'm hearing a lot about retention, and then especially through the whole COVID, right, where We've had to learn things that we never thought we would have to learn. And it's allowed us, sure, to be more adaptable and to have to pivot. It's, you know, and those are the positives, and I hope that we take those things away and keep those things, because I like to always think of positives. But some of the downsides or the cons of COVID for that adaptability and pivoting is the, you know, people who are suffering from any type of disability, right? And mostly from a mental health perspective, it's been very difficult on them. And even people who didn't have a heightened disability or a heightened level of mental health awareness have certainly had to deal with that and had to cope. So it's on top of that forcing employers, right? And so from my perspective where I work with employers, it's having to get the employers to understand that in most cases they don't know what they don't know. You know, that's always one of my sayings to you, is that we don't know what we don't know. But it's understanding about accommodation. It's understanding, what does that mean? What does inclusivity mean? What does having a diverse workplace mean? So it really comes back to, you know, one of the things that we were talking about today, which is education.
Absolutely, I really appreciate that. Shelley, just to stick with you for a minute, how do we involve all employees? Because I know leaders come to you and go, you know, I want this, or I want this to be our culture, and I am committed, I want to be inclusive. But, you know, I think that there's this sense that sometimes it's only the leaders, or it's not the leaders, and it's only the employees, and there seems to be a disconnect. Can you help us bring together how we need to really bring everyone in?
Right. So, today, one of the things that I was really enjoying was when Mme Laroche spoke about leadership from the top, at the top. And I am a big believer in that because, you know, let's face it, as the CEO of reachAbility, you can create any policy that you'd like to create, right? Your ability to be successful launching that policy and sustaining that policy is only going to be in direct proportion to the people who are going to be managing that. So first off, have you included them and got their buy-in, right? And so that is a part of inclusion right there, right? Is including all of those and being open to perspective and open to feedback. And then taking that all the way down through the organization. And that could be through committee involvement, asking for people to participate. But I really believe that everybody has an ownership to be, not only to be heard, but to also to have a voice, right? So sharing their perspective, sharing their needs in what they need.
Makes a lot of sense. So it takes me right back to you, Jess, because let's say right now we have someone who's really interested in saying, yes, I love what you're saying. Yes, Tova. Yes, Mme Laroche, we're ready. Now what? What would they expect if they were to reach out and say, this inclusion in action sounds like exactly what I need, but where do I begin?
Well, you have to just start, really. There is no perfect beginning point. You have to say that, you know, you have some goals, and really sit down and figure out what the goals are so that you can plan. And so, you know, I would encourage, if anybody is looking at getting some support for setting their plan as part of the Deputy Minister's commitments, they do have to also have a plan. It's a little bit different than for a business doing an action plan, but it's very similar with the same steps and the same responsibilities. So I guess just be to reach out and say that you want to start. Because
really, I know you're already working with some communities, municipalities, post-secondaries, and creating, I mean, inclusion in action isn't new, it's just new to perhaps these viewers. So I wanted to also be able to say, like, we've got this office, we know what we've got to do, we understand the directives, but what can they expect perhaps when they reach out to you?
Yeah, so we always start with a consultation, like a meeting with the stakeholders or the leaders, some people from all levels. I'm not, you know, when we're doing an action plan for the ACA, we have to have an advisory committee. I understand that there are different already existing committees within the federal government that within each department. So it would really be to start with that committee and figure out what your goals are and set some benchmarks. And then we start from there. A big part of what we do is engaging, which was what Shelley was talking about, was getting everybody involved. You hear a lot about working with equity groups when we're reviewing the deputy minister commitments, and that really can start from within your organization, reaching out and making sure that the group that is setting the goals and that's working on the plan involves people from all different equity groups.
Right, so ensuring that we're being inclusive within the group. The worst thing is to look at a group and see everyone looking the same or homogenous. It doesn't seem very inclusive.
Right, no, you want to be representative of who you want to serve, and that's a starting point. You don't want to have just all of the leaders making the decisions, because then it's not going to create that climate of change that Deputy Minister Laroche was talking about, which is one of the overall goals of the ACA, is to create that climate of change.
We've talked a bit about the general IIA, Jess, but I do want to get into the plan piece a little bit. And we talked about there's some steps. And I know initially we want people to have an advisory committee. I'm sure many of our federal government public service employee departments already have some form of advisory committee, so I'm not as concerned about that piece. What would be the next thing we would do for them, or what are some of the things that we would provide if you were to reach out to us?
Yeah, so like I said, we get together and we have a consultation and really pinpoint the goals that we're looking to achieve. They say Rome wasn't built in a day, so we have to really set out some realistic goals that we're going to try to aim for within the next 2 years. That can always be revisited and reassessed and revised, to keep with your isms, Tova. And then, then we put out an engagement plan of how we're going to really find out if those are the same issues and barriers that are faced by the people that we're trying to serve, and create the plan for. So that is where we would utilize the survey. We set up a number of different types of engagement, whether they're in person or online, to really get the feedback from as many stakeholders or people involved as we can, so that we can make sure that we're identifying the correct barriers. We can always say the barriers that we see, but we need to hear from the people with disabilities, from the people who are facing the barriers, what they are and what the key points are, so that we can include those in the action plan.
Right, and at that point, I'm just going to cut you off, because I'm curious, what are some of the types of questions we ask in a survey? And of course, I'm really curious, why are those questions being asked, in terms of what are some of the things we'd like to discover, Carrie?
Okay, so that's a really good question. We pride ourselves on being able to customize the surveys based on the individual needs of the organizations. So there are some basic questions that we ask, demographic type ones, but then we get into breaking it down into the different pillars and ask very specific questions that look at physical barriers. They look at employment, if policies and procedures are working, what retention looks like, if people are being promoted within the organization correctly. Again, it goes back to just the very specific needs of each individual organization.
And these questions can glean that. I guess I'm very naive about survey questions, because sometimes I read those questions and I'm curious, because I'm looking at it going, why are they even asking it? Because I don't understand how we get there. Can you give us a little bit of that?
It's when you're looking at a survey, the questions on their own, they don't really stand very well on their own, but it's when you get into correlating them with the different demographics, the different groups, if people have disabilities, if they don't, and using that information to really pull out the answers that we're looking for. The other thing that we really try to do is we use a lot of the Likert scales, so we're trying to avoid the neutral responses. We're trying to make sure that we have a very definite plus or negative on either side, which allows the ability to really make change. A lot of people will just naturally gravitate to the I'm not sure, or in the middle, and that doesn't give us anything to work with. So we try to avoid that as much as possible.
Interesting. How much do you need to have people actually write things in versus maybe a scaling thing? I'm always curious about that. Can you actually do an effective survey through just like a scale of 1 to 10, or do you have to have more descriptive? And I have one more add-on to that. Can you touch on the emotion piece? Because I know in the past we have done surveys as part of our inclusion action for some different clients, and they were concerned about the emotion piece, and I wanted to address it because it threw me. I hadn't thought of it.
So that's two
I'm
questions.
unpacking a few things.
Yep. Which is fine.
Forgive me.
No, and I think that is also something that needs to be addressed, is that the questions are not just the closed-ended questions, they are open-ended. So there is a lot of opportunity for people to add their lived experience, which is what we need. And like Jess said, it's not just the survey that we're gleaning this data from, it's also the personal engagement, and that's where we really get more depth and meat into things. But from the survey perspective, you were asking the emotion piece. But emotion is it's very hard to determine. Like your idea of happy and my idea of happy are very different. And so we try to leave those pieces out and we try to make it more concrete. So it's basically the answers that we're getting from the survey, it's very easy to see whether people are feeling happy or sad about things. It's more of a concrete answer than an abstract one. And so we have to leave the how do you feel about this and how do you feel about that out and ask more specific questions in order to sort of pull that information out.
That makes a lot of sense. Before I ask Shelley my next question, I want to encourage all of our viewers to send in their questions through to the link, because we're going to be moving to your questions shortly, and of course want lots of time to be able to do just that. Shelley, what is your role in terms of, again, this employer going, okay, I'm ready? What do you do for that employer in addition to, of course, I know we work with you, you're one of the experts we bring in when someone says, I need another level of HR perspective, and of course that's one of the things Inclusion in Action is bringing in those experts, and today we brought in a few. But tell me, what's your role in terms of when someone says to you, I want to do better? Or where does it begin and end? Is there one?
Oh, wow, that's a really big question.
There's no
I want to
end,
do
is there,
better. Well, I think, in the context of this discussion and, thinking from our viewers' perspective from the federal public service is, what do I do? How do I do better, right? My role is I have a lot of clients, I have a lot of contacts, so you might reach out to me from one of the departments as one of the leaders, and you might ask me that very question. Well, the beauty of, building community and building partnerships is that I'm going to be able to reach out to my various partners, of which one is reachAbility, and I'm going to be able to put you in touch with exactly what you need at any given time. So it might be that you yourself as a leader want to have some coaching, right, on next steps or how to build a plan, right? That might be something I can help you with. It might be that you need to have, a survey and you're not sure what that means, and I can put you in touch with, Carrie at reachAbility. It might be that, you're looking to have some education. And, I think we heard that today, that, education is going to be key. You're going to come up with an action plan, and there's going to be so many things that you don't know. And it's going to be really probably one of the very first steps is getting people educated on even just things like terminology. What is bias? What is unconscious bias? What is first voice? What does confident mean? What's the definition of disability? What's the definition of accommodation? So sort of unpacking that around education. So I'm going to put you in touch again, in this case, with reachAbility, and we're going to be able to have either some off-the-shelf, training that, we have developed specifically for these needs, or we're going to be able to customize something. So I'm able to put you in touch with the right people. If we're looking for, hiring, in specific areas or having a broader outreach, again, I can put you in touch with organizations and communities that have the outreach to meet your goals.
That makes a lot of sense. Jess, I want to go back to you because we kind of stopped on the steps around the plan after the survey. So the results of the survey are coming in, and we've learned what we need to learn in terms of challenges and unique perspectives and the voice, again, not for us, without us. We've given voice to all of these diverse employees. What would you do then?
So we take all of the information that we've gathered, and we always go back to the original group of stakeholders to go back and reassess. So, we might have started out with an initial, 4 goals of thinking that, and just in keeping with what we've been talking about today, so thinking that we need to get some unconscious bias training, thinking that we need to immediately get a hold of some equity groups and start engaging them, thinking that we need to review our policies for the way that we hire people. And so on. So we might think that those are the goals and those are the issues that we want to focus on. But because we've been able to, through our process, get that first person voice through the survey, through the different engagement strategies, and allow people to actually share with us as a third party, because as we've seen in the comments on the stream today and through some of the questions, working within a government agency, there is a lot of stigma or felt, that's based on the comments that we've gotten. And so working with a third-party agency like reachAbility through this process is quite helpful. So we would go back to the group and say, from the information that we've gleaned from all of the gathering from the surveys and the engagement sessions, yes, they do agree that unconscious bias training will be helpful, but they don't see an issue in the policies around hiring. What they see an issue in is the policies around people getting promoted, or moving between in the interdepartmental movement or something. So then we can, go back and reassess what our original goals were and really fine-tune what is going to go into the action plan for making change. And the great thing about doing that and then putting it into the action plan is that, as Carrie mentioned, this process is able to be reassessed. So whether it's quarterly or annually, we're able to go back and reassess and be able to see those improvements and to be able to measure that change and then see, okay, well now what is our priority for the next year? We've seen some improvements. Now what are we going to go and set as a priority? Or maybe we didn't. Maybe we hit them or we missed the mark, right? So, but being able to reassess and go back and revisit is really, really helpful.
So we've got the survey, we've identified from the results really that maybe we were right on the nose or maybe we missed a few things and we need to look at those as our priorities. Now we were meeting with our friends from the Federal Public Service, we've discussed that piece, and we provide them with what at that point?
We would provide them with an action plan with timelines and measurables and anticipated budgets and how to move forward, which would include most likely, especially again, because it's referenced in the commitments, a number of different steps that would involve training. It would probably include revisiting the certain policies and meeting with consultants to be able to make those policies more inclusive of everybody. So it would include all of those things that would be outlined in the action plan, which would also be made public as a part of the Deputy Minister's commitments and also the ACA.
Now, I know that we work with some different groups and we couldn't, in terms of experts, and we couldn't get them all in today. But tell me the role of, for instance, architects, because I know we have some architects that we work with as well around inclusion and action, and maybe some other folks that I'm maybe not thinking about that really fill out the team, or you often call on?
Yeah, so we work with a number of different architects in order to get the built space assessments done. There hasn't been a large emphasis on built space, as it was one of the first pillars addressed by the ACA, and it's probably something that's most familiar to most people. So today we've really been trying to talk about things that are somewhat more stigmatized and therefore less kind of talked about, which would be more invisible disabilities. But we do work with architects and different organizations who can do environmental scans and assessments, and to be able to provide, strategic plans around making things more accessible physically. Also with sensory, they're able to provide those things. So we work with a number of different folks who are Recanson certified to be able to go through and do those assessments. And then, you know, if the goal is to work towards a certain standard of Rick Hansen certification, we include that as part of the action plan.
I know we work with some folks from the Rick Hansen team.
Yeah.
We work with builders. I know we work with some architects, depending on the need of the client.
Yeah, and we also work with like marketing and branding consultants that we bring in to be able to help with the different engagement opportunities and strategies. We, as you can see, we don't know what we don't know. So the great thing about being a smaller organization is we're able to work with experts in the field who are able to bring the strengths to the table that we may not have the expertise in. And we do that, you know, and we coordinate all that through our inclusion, action, accessibility services.
I think it's really important that people know that, because I think you need to be able to go beyond your walls, your four walls, if you're going to be seriously inclusive and bring all those experts to the table. No NGO, in my opinion, is going to have all those pieces. We can't afford a Shelley. But what I want to say is, it's people like Shelley who partner with us and bring a level of expertise that we wouldn't otherwise have, that makes, I think, the way we approach inclusion and action so important. We're not trying to say we've got it all. We're saying, what do we need? And then let's bring in those experts. And we have, you know, sort of corralled that group. And I think that's really interesting. What are some of the surprises from any of you that you've experienced around this piece of discovery and inclusion in terms of some of the clients you've already worked with, or you know, anything that surprised you? I think I want to know. Shelley.
Well, just on that, I think one of the things that I'd like to, you know, really point out that I suspect, you know, will be, you know, very similar in the federal public service is that, you know, we often think that we're going up one avenue, right? And then we need to take a twist, and that could come either from the survey, right? It could come from, you know, various discussions that we have, and hiring out to a third party, right? In a lot of cases, or partnering with a third party, allows you to have that 20,000 foot up. In the federal public service, let's face it, you have people that are skilled in pretty much everything. So you might say, why would I reach out to, you know, Shelley for her, you know, employment law expertise? Well, when you're trying to build that new policy or look at that new policy, you're pretty attached to that policy because you've been using that policy for years, right? So we tend to have already some bias towards the policy that we have. So we only want to ever change just a couple words, or I'm just going to tweak it a little bit. But bringing it to somebody from outside helps you to change perspective. And one of the big things that we talked about, and as Mme Laroche talked about in the number 5, was a culture shift, a culture of inclusivity. Well, you can't do that if you're holding on to everything that you had in the past and only wanting to change a few things, or take what you had in the past and jam it into the new future whole, right? So it's important that having that outside set of eyes gives you a whole different perspective, right? And allows you to be able to say that, you know, you've had experts, and I'm talking from, you know, your role as a leader within the public service is to be able to say, you know, I've had partnered with, and we've have experts from outside who've looked at this, and this is the way we need to go to create the culture that you've said we need to have, that you've requested. I think that's so powerful, that why are we engaging community when we're filled with experts? We need the perspective, we need that outside looking in everything we do in life. It's so important not to expect ourselves when we're in the middle of it to see it. Why would this be any different? I think that's a really powerful point, and I thank you for that. I thought at this point we might invite Mara back. Mara is going to be bringing us some of your questions directly from the stream. Mara, how about we hear from you?
Hi. So we've been getting some good questions coming in from YouTube, and the first one is a question around retaining employees with disabilities. So on the one hand, obviously, we're really interested in how are we going to connect. You know, many employers right now are trying to connect with more employees with disabilities, but what supports do you think are really important to put in place to successfully retain employees?
Well, I'd like to jump on that one immediately if I could, because the number one thing I always tell people is it's from the moment that person is exposed to you. Your card, your inclusion card, is actually the application for the job if it's an outside person. If it's already someone within the business, then the first step is, of course, ensuring that your orientation, your integration is perceiving universal design, is thinking about what that means. You don't have to worry about the person's individual challenge if you're inclusive from the get-go. So if your orientation welcomes everyone, you don't have to worry about if they're welcomed, because you've taken a universal design approach. And God forbid we wait for someone to say, I've got a problem to address it, because frankly, if we're really doing our job and we're removing not just the architectural barriers, but the attitudinal as well, that person's entry will be as seamless as anybody else. You know, I say it a lot, dignity, plain and simple. All employees deserve the same thing: to be heard, to be understood, to be given the tools to do the best they can, and in turn, ultimately to be the best they can. And if we create an environment where everyone is welcome, we don't have to worry about the detail, because we've created this space that is safe and welcoming to everybody.
I also think, Mayor,
please, anyone else?
That as we're trying to work towards that safer space, that being open to discussing, as Shelley had shared, that perhaps, you know, if there's a challenge, maybe it's not the right person, right job, or perhaps the role needs to shift a little bit to fit the person better, and just being open to discussing about accommodation, and understanding that, as Tova just said, that it's really about changes in attitude and less about what it's going to cost, or, you know, that it's going to be difficult. It's really about looking at it from a different perspective and saying that, you know, like, we want to keep this employee. So where is the barrier? What's the challenge? And how can we, you know, shift amongst roles, or provide more support? Or as you had alluded to earlier, you know, now that we're in kind of the COVID space, what type of flexibility can we put in the role to make it so that, you know, if it's about time, or if it's about, you know, technical materials or whatever, how can we kind of help manage that? So just having an open dialogue and understanding that there is ease to accommodation, and not being, you know, scared of what that's going to look like.
You know, the number one request for accommodation in Canada by employees is flexible time. So COVID certainly taught us a bit about that, taught me a lot. But it's true that we might think that the number one thing is we've got to have this do that, or that do this. But the truth is, flexibility is the number one request. And I remember walking into a public sector experimental office where they were doing incredible work around inclusion and wanting to be welcoming, and they had everything physical down. And I noticed they had all these chairs in the hallway. And I said, now what would you do if someone with visual impairment walked down that hall? Because you've pulled all the chairs out. He goes, oh, well, don't worry about that. We're really focused on making sure that the chairs are big and wide. I'm like, well, I am worried about that, because you're being inclusive of the architectural challenges, but we must be sure that we're going beyond the architectural.
Thank you. That's great. And talking about universal design, there was a question that came through about that. Can you touch on how universal design is beneficial to not just the individual who, you know, it's the nature of universal design, but going beyond the individual with the request or who has the particular need, and how it benefits all employees potentially? Maybe you could talk to that, Tova, what that looks like, how it benefits all of us.
Well, universal design, the best example I can give you is a hotel. Because a hotel door slides. Long before there were laws about inclusion and the ACA, the door slides. Why does the door slide? Well, they want people with luggage to get in. They want people with baby strollers. You can tell I'm a grandmother already. The strollers coming in. They want to make sure people who use walkers and canes and wheelchairs are coming in. That's the essence of universal design. By having a sliding door, we're not only addressing a person who uses a wheelchair, we're addressing anyone who might have their hands full, who might, for other reasons, require those doors to slide. Universal design is about including as many people as possible. It does not always have to be the fancy fanciest, most expensive way. I'm not suggesting anyone else do this, but I am an NGO, and years ago, I had a young lady who had some arthritis, and she simply could not turn the doorknob. And our printer room had a doorknob. She had no problem with other doors, but this particular one. And, you know, we thought about it, and I could have ordered a special new door. I'm an NGO. So I literally took the doorknob out, I sanded the edges, and she would stick her finger through and pull the door open. Now, I'm not telling you that's the answer, but sometimes we get tied into this mentality of, oh my God, if we need to put an elevator in this place just for people with disability to access it. No, I'm not about pie in the sky. I'm about practical and realistic, and that's one of the reasons I've been so successful for 20 years. It's because I'm not telling everyone to blow it up. I'm saying let's work with what we've got, but let's engage as many people as possible, and that's universal design.
Thank you. So another question that's come through on the feed, I'm going to point this one to Jess. Jess, do you think this event has been fully accessible, and what more could we do potentially?
Interesting question.
Oh, thank you, Mara.
Busted. Go, Jess.
Putting that
It's a great
me.
question. Great question.
Well, I can tell you that we can always strive to do better, but I think that we have done a good job. Digital or online events are always more accessible to more people because technology, as Tova says, is the
IT, the great equalizer, I call it. That's right.
Yeah. So being where it's online, those folks who, for instance, our audience from the Federal Public Service wouldn't have been able to attend today, whether they identify as having a disability or not, but because of COVID protocol. We have our lovely friends doing our ASL sign language today, which we very much appreciate, and we always strive to have ASL available. We've got our CART transcription, which is online, and so, you know, it's in a nice, accessible space here at the library. We can follow COVID protocols, as weird as it is to be completely far apart from everybody. But I think you're never completely accessible. I'm sure when we're done this, we're going to find out, you know, a handful of things that we could have done better, but that's okay. I don't think that you're ever going to have perfection when it comes to accessibility, but it's trying to consider as many people as you can when doing something.
And making some tough choices, Jess, because I'm often asked to speak at places that are so inaccessible, I'm embarrassed, and I had to make a decision, and I did. I made the decision not to present in inaccessible places because I wasn't setting a modeling. I was saying it's okay, when frankly I did not feel it to be okay, and I did not think it was inclusive or represented universal design. So, you know, sometimes we have to take that unpleasant stand. I spoke to it briefly about people getting into a conversation and maybe saying something that isn't really comfortable, but that's what an ally does. And we're all committed to being allies, and that means sometimes even being a tad uncomfortable with that and what that means. And yes, we might miss something. And believe me, I have had people come up to me and give me all kinds of reasons why they didn't feel I was inclusive enough. And I take them on and I hear them, and the next time we talk about them. We've never had an event where afterward we didn't sit down and say, how could we have done better? And universal design being key, but also just everyone feeling welcome. Isn't that what we're talking about?
Yeah.
And feeling heard, and also hearing what they need to hear, communicating to everyone. Otherwise, you're talking to yourself in the shower.
Yeah,
and that just goes back to being, being fluid and constantly learning. It's education for everybody always, and things are always going to be changing and evolving, and we just take it by stride and learn as we go as well when we're trying to keep improving and moving forward.
Right, and I think leading by example. I think if anybody's on our social media, you'll probably be able to see a photo of what this room looks like from behind the scenes. And you know, we have a lot of folks here helping us run the event.
Jess, I would have hung up my coat if I knew you were showing them behind the scenes.
It definitely wasn't, you know, I mean, it's been pretty easy for me today, but it wasn't necessarily as easy to get this event up and running for the folks who are doing the hard work. But it's not about easy, it's about what, as Tova said, it's about what is best for everybody. And, you know, I don't think that we necessarily had anybody come to us or let us know that they required any of this accommodation today, because it's not special. It's just something that we do. Right. We try to lead by example, and we'll continue to keep trying to do better.
You said not special, and you know, I've got to jump on this because that's one of my real essence. People think of accommodation is special, and there is nothing special when you are creating a fair and equitable environment. The obvious and easy example is if there's no ramp, but there's much deeper ones, but let's use that. The fact is, if I cannot get into your library because it doesn't have a ramp for me and I happen to use a walker and I need a ramp, then is it really a special accommodation that you're giving me, or are we simply equalizing the playing field? That's why I'm very careful about the term special sitting in front of the term accommodation, because I think it infers we are no longer just equalizing the playing field, but they're getting something. You know, somebody sitting by a window who's visually impaired and needs natural light. Why they get the window? There's nothing special. If you communicate appropriately to your team, it is about equalizing the playing field, plain and simple.
So the next question that came through actually really jumps off of what you were just talking about, Tova, and that was, and this can seem kind of obvious in a sense, like we all want to be like, no, that's not a thing, but I think we've all seen this in our workplaces, how sometimes a dynamic can exist where if someone gets an accommodation, other people can be saying, well, that's not fair, because this person is getting treated, you know, that seems like a good deal to me, that's not fair, I want that deal. So how can we work as leaders in an environment where we are giving people different treatment because of different needs?
Shelley, do you want to start with that one? Because boy, do I know you've got it.
Well, that's a great, I hear that all the time, and that's actually, that is actually the fear of most owners, managers, leaders, as to why they're sort of loath to touch an accommodation. Because if I allow that person to work from home, or if I give that person, one of my greatest ones before COVID was a client that had an employee that required a sit-stand desk. Well, they're a little bit more expensive, and this employer had already turned down a few people that wanted these, what he saw as little special desks, right? So then his fear was that he's going to have to supply those desks to everybody, right? So using, you know, kind of extrapolating on that example. Where I think we can do better, okay, as leaders and employers, is talking about what does accommodation mean, right? And what does right person, right job, having the right tools to be successful in the role. And that means that we will and should be creating individualized plans, right, to make people successful. Because Tova, what you might need and what I might need to do exactly the same job, right, might look very different, right? But at the end of the day, I will be successful if I have that blue pen, if you will, all right? So I think it's important to understand, but it comes from educating and implementing what is your plan, what's your policy, what's your culture going to be, what's your value going to be in the organization. And when people understand that, then they'll see it less as, oh, well, Carrie got something special. She gets to sit beside that window, and I've always wanted that window, right? So removing that, right? People have to understand. They need to know the why, right? They don't need to really know why is it that Carrie got that? Like, they don't need to know her medical condition, because frankly, that's none of their business. But what they need to know is that they're not being treated differently. So that if I come to work one day with a broken leg, right, and I need an accommodation for that, that you're going to do everything in your power as the employer to help me with that, and not just say, too bad, you need to stay home, or you're going to be without a job, right? I can't accommodate you.
I'd like to build off that a little bit, because I have, just to take that and take it to a next place, right. I also believe it is the responsibility of leaders and managers Absolutely. To handle that piece and to understand how to communicate the difference between a special, which we don't believe in, and accommodation, which is equalizing the playing field for somebody. Right. Exactly. And by putting that message out from the beginning, and letting everyone know, when you need something, I will support you, right. But right now this person needs something and I'm supporting them. it's
Correct.
really, it is from the head down. I mean, it really is, that's where
Absolutely.
the leadership must come in and the manager must understand. But if the manager has not been given those tools to be able to communicate that, and perhaps they don't even understand that accommodation is not special because the manager sees it as special, we have a problem. And again, it takes us back to why education for leadership is a core activity that the Inclusion in Action does, and why reachAbility's only social enterprise deals with ensuring these kinds of fact thinking is removed because it's incorrect. And it's the leader's responsibility. By the way, I love the example of the lifting desk because I offered it to someone in my office who expressed having a bad back, and then a few people said I'd like it, and I got it for anyone who wanted it because it isn't that expensive, and it means, again, everyone will feel like if they need it and they want to stand, they're going to have less likely to have problems with bad backs and all the things we hear about sitting stationary all day. So sometimes it's actually a great opportunity to improve everyone. We don't have to fix the floor just for one person. Everyone will benefit from that floor having a little cushioning and not being so hard on us when we stand.
Right, absolutely.
So the next question that came through, I'm going to turn this one to all of you one at a time. Maybe we'll start with Carrie because we haven't heard from Carrie in a minute. So this question is, on an individual level, what would you recommend to any public servant who wants to make a difference in their workplace? What would be your one must-do piece of advice for people to take away today?
I'm glad you got that.
Or Carrie, I'm glad you got that first.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure. I think the one important piece coming from a research perspective is taking out preconceived notion about what this needs to look like. It's going to be different for everybody. It's going to be an individual thing, but everybody needs to take it on, and they need to do it with an open heart and realize that they need to kind of look outside the box a little bit and see things in a different perspective than they maybe have before. And also realize that the organization wants to see it in a different perspective. And so that ability to do that is being supported by the people around you.
Yeah, I think change is difficult. So I think I'm going to get that tattooed. It's something that is kind of a reoccurring theme. But change is difficult for everybody. And so, but this is a good change. So I think that just to understand that this isn't expected to be an easy transition, but that it is going to be for a good purpose, and that you're not having to, go through this process alone. It's a challenge that, and a commitment that the entire country has taken on. Everyone is kind of going through this change and having these shifts in thinking, and we're all kind of doing this together. So I guess I would implore you to not try to do this alone, to kind of reach outside of your existing bubble, to collaborate and communicate with other departments, with other team members, and to really just try and bring in the experts. We happen to know a few, but not just to have like a shameless plug, but to just know that you're not doing this alone, and that there are a lot of people that can help through this process, so that you can feel supported, because it's not going to go away. This is something that we're all going to have to do, and it'll get easier as we revisit, as the years go on and we start to make progress, and the progress will feel really good. And then we'll want to make more progress. And as Deputy Minister Laroche said, we're going to see a whole climate of change, and the culture is going to shift. And it's going to get easier as we go, and it's going to benefit everyone.
So right away, I think what we all could do, regardless of what your position is as a federal public service employee, is we can participate. So that it can come in many forms. Speaking up, openly and honestly answering in surveys, and really just to kind of put another spin on the participating is trying, giving it a good old try, because I can assure you, you will be revising, you will be revisiting, and you will be reassessing that action plan, okay, and those goals, okay, many times before you get your actual action plan down.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's great information. For me, well, there's really 18 things that I'd like you to think about because there's 18 inclusionisms, but I actually want to refer to win-win-win because I think if there's one thing I want you to take away is that there is actually no loser in inclusion.
Right.
And that's what I love. You know, we talked about universal design and all kinds of things, but win-win-win really comes from, well, years ago, Stephen Covey, who wrote about the Minute Managers, very well known, wrote about win-win. And that was where he said to used car salesmen, look, you don't have to have the client lose for you to win. And that was like a bit of a revelation in business, that you can have the used car salesman win by having a decent deal out of the car, and the guy who bought it didn't overpay too much. That's win-win. I just believed we needed to take it to the next level if we're going to be inclusive. And that's where the term win-win-win comes from. The idea is, if you're going to move forward with any action, think about the fact that there are 3 wins in everything you do. And by doing that and taking a moment and thinking where the 3 wins were, well, my employee will win, they might get a promotion, whereas before this opportunity, we may not have looked at that person as a promotion. That's a win. But the crew wins because we're really showing diversity, which has been proven over and over again to give us better opportunities for ideas and creativity and solving problems. And so there's a win for the team. And then of course, we as Canadians win because, to be honest with you, everyone will have had, has, or is going to have a disability. So the more we include everyone, frankly, the more we win, win, win.
Thank you, Tova. So that concludes our questions, and I'm going to pass back to Tova now just for final remarks. Thank everyone out there who sent in questions today and who engaged in this. We really appreciate people's time and energy for this important subject, and here's Tova for our final remarks.
Well, I've always got a few remarks, but first of all, allow me to thank everyone you've met today, and Kelsey and the whole team behind the scenes, our great friends providing us ASL today and more. And I want to thank everyone for doing this. This link will be available, and we're going to get it up and running and get it. I look at Jess because she's my tech person, but I also want you to know we are going to have this up and running and ready for you so you can share it with everyone. If you have any questions, all you have to do is reach out to info, I-N-F-O, at reachability.org. We will answer anything. You want to hear from me, Tova? Just write Tova at reachability.org. And definitely our website, www.reachability.org, will allow you to really identify all of the things we've been talking about today and how we can support you. I've already mentioned we're on pre-order for Amazon.com and CA if you're interested in purchasing Win-Win-Win. And these 18 inclusionisms, I'm just so excited about having been able to share them with you, because this book isn't officially launched really for another couple of weeks. But today's event, we wanted to make sure that we brought some of the messages from this, and right from the moment Mme Laroche joined us till this moment, it has been a consistent theme. Win and win-win works for everyone. Inclusion is where you are going. You've been asked to do it, and we're here to tell you we'd love to help you do it too. And we're all available to answer any questions well beyond today. So thank you everyone for joining us. And just remember that we are Canada, we are including everyone, and never let the fact that we are so kind and so careful and loving of each other to stop us from engaging people because we're worried about hurting their feelings, because that's the worst thing we could do. Dignity means including everybody, and that's really what we need to do. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Jess and Mara, Mme Laroche, Kelsey, who's been taking all those questions, and the entire team. Have a wonderful day, and do share this link with those that were unable to see it today. Bye for now.